Welcome. Good evening to our viewers we're here in Naples United Church of Christ. My name is Sharon Harris Ewing. I serve as assistant minister. I'm joined by my colleagues, Reverend Dr. Dawson Taylor, the senior minister, and Reverend Dr. Deb Kaiser Cross, our minister for congregational care. This is the second week of our clergy roundtable discussing the book Forgive to Live. And we will be talking tonight about chapters 3 through 5, pages 45 to 101, if you're following along. If you would like to purchase the book, you can email books@naplesucc.org, and Chelsea, our receptionist, will get a book out to you. We want to be sure to thank the people who make this possible, especially Wendy and our AV people, Tony and Brad, and we thank you for joining us. We hope that you find these conversations to be stimulating and to help you to think about your own lives as we think about ours and share our reflections on this very thoughtful book. So I'm going to get us started, and Chapter 3 feels very important to me because it's really about anger. And anger and what we do with our anger is at the center of a lot of what Dr. Tibbet says we need to deal with if we're going to be able to forgive. So he says, all of us know an angry person, but not one of us is an angry person. So he gives us some ideas, but I want your ideas. Why do you think that we recognize anger in others, but not in ourselves?
All right, I'll start.
Well, I was going to say, did you have to look at me when you said?
I know, right?
Yeah.
I think it goes back to how good we are at denial in our own lives of our negative emotions. So I think I deny when I'm angry, when I'm tired, when I'm frustrated, even when everyone around me, especially my dear sweet husband, can notice it. He just gets real quiet because I'm not aware of it, because those negative emotions aren't ones I like to own. But the second part of it is the reason we don't recognize it in ourselves but it's easy to do it in others, is because we tend to look at others and acknowledge their negatives more than we're ever going to acknowledge our own negatives. So that's where I am with it.
Yeah, I think that I'm less likely to do it because when I make a list, either, well, in my head of people that I consider angry people, it's a painful list. And so I don't want to be included in it, right? So I don't want to acknowledge either my ability to be that angry or that I ever exhibit that level of anger, because I don't want to be, quote, that person. You know, I don't want to be included in that list. I want to be included in the saints list. I don't want to be in the other list. So I mean, I think it's, because when you ask that question, I was kind of thinking about people who immediately come to mind, or moments that have come to mind, and I don't want to be that person.
I think you also wrote down, we tend to attribute the best motives to ourselves and assume the worst motives in other people.
Yeah.
In your notes, and I thought, oh, that is so accurate.
Well, I was going to pick up on that because he does talk about some of the factors that he sees, and he says we justify our anger. We might even think it's righteous, and we see it as perhaps coming from without. Somebody else caused us to be angry, not from within, and we do assume the worst of others. He also talks about that we're trained to believe that showing anger is bad.
Yeah.
So my next question is, when you get angry, which line of reasoning, either of those or others, do you use to justify your anger most often?
It's always the righteous anger. Always. Always, always. I mean, hear me clearly. I'm not saying that's good or even justified. I mean, I do think that it is it's the self-righteous anger.
And mine is definitely that I assume negative intent on with the other person and the best possible intent for myself.
Okay, so I don't disagree that those are different, but I am grouping those when I talk about self-righteous.
Oh, that makes sense.
Okay, because I wanted to make sure that I wasn't misunderstanding how those are defined, because sometimes my self-righteous, this is like group therapy time. Okay, we may have to edit this out at some point. But like sometimes my self-righteous anger will come out as feeling self-righteous because I presume negative intention. You don't have to nod so agreeably.
Oh, wait,
No. I'm just.
It's the concept I'm agreeing with,
Oh,
not
of
the.
course. No, but but that will be sometimes where the level of anger or frustration will come out. And so that's why I say, because I can have self-righteous anger on large, worldly social issues or justice issues, but I can also classify it as the self-righteous when I jump to conclusions or assume, things like that. So that's where I was trying to, okay, yeah.
Well,
How
so
about you?
just to round it out, one of the things that I think I'm guilty of, the notion that anger comes from without is, the classic, you make me so angry.
Oh.
I mean,
yeah.
that you're doing this to me rather than I'm having this reaction and I
Yeah.
can choose to have a different reaction.
Yeah.
So before we go too much further, I think we should talk about what is anger. Dr. Tibbetts says that anger is a strong emotion of displeasure brought on by feelings of helplessness and hopelessness, a response to pain, a wake-up call that something is wrong. And he goes on, and we will talk about both the good side and the bad side of anger. But I'm curious what anger means to you and what you learned about anger as a child, and maybe how that affects how you think about it now.
I'll start with the anger as a child, and I think this is definitely something I learned as my age, I'll give away my age, but as a child in the 60s in a Catholic school environment, and as a girl, nice girls don't get angry, or certainly if they get angry, they don't show their anger. And so it was very difficult for me to learn how to do it. So I either stuffed my anger or I exploded with anger. I don't know if explosion is actually accurate, but I didn't figure out ways to express anger, nor was it really talked about in my home, like what's appropriate to say to each other. And so that was really difficult. And for me, I really found the helpful definition of anger was the continuum he talked about, that went from, you start with annoyed and then you go to irritated, upset, hostile, enraged, and then resentful. And I think anger has so many facets, but we sometimes forget there's a lot of variations in there on that continuum. So I recognize annoyed and irritated. I don't own the other stuff as much.
Yeah. I really reflected on this, trying to think how these lessons were taught to me, but I honestly don't remember. But I was definitely taught that anger was not an okay emotion, that it was not appropriate. And how I experienced anger in my home was, tended to go from like 0 to 60. That was kind of how it happened. And so, and so my siblings and I, and actually kind of with my parents, have reflected on that as we've gotten older, and how particularly my siblings want to model things for their children, and and things like that. And I just remember a very vivid premarital counseling I did many years ago for a couple, and one of the people getting married because I often ask, how did you experience conflict in your home growing up? And one of the people getting married said that their parents went behind a closed door, fought, and so they never saw conflict. And one of the other person being married, the other person in the couple said that they had a vivid memory of their mother pulling the phone where the phone cord came out of the wall because she had become so angry. And I was like, okay, so this might be a possibility where you have different understandings of conflict in your relationship. And I can say that they're no longer together because I just remember thinking, oh, this is going to be very interesting, because I think how you see conflict and how you see anger in your growing up is very indicative of how it's charted moving forward without some intentional work or some intentionality behind it. Yeah.
And I think I would say, much like you, Deb, I certainly, it wasn't really modeled and it wasn't really taught. And part of what that meant, I mean, I'm sure there was conflict and anger, but I wasn't aware of it. And so in terms of your marriage example, part of what that meant was that in those first years of marriage, I had to figure out that this doesn't mean it's not going to work. This is just what happens when people live together.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And that is part of it. Well, Tibbet says that hurt and anger are two sides of the same coin. Do you agree with that? And would you say that you tend to express hurt or anger more?
Okay, I'm gonna expand it a little bit
Go for it.
because
Go for
this
it.
is the therapist part
Right,
of me.
exactly.
Anger is a primary emotion.
Okay, so I was going to ask you, I thought it was secondary, so it's primary?
Anger is,
Okay.
yeah. No, you're right. It's a secondary emotion. Anger is a secondary emotion, but hurt is not the only primary emotion underneath anger.
Okay.
There's also embarrassment,
Yeah.
disappointment, fear
Yeah.
can be underneath anger. So I think expanding it beyond hurt is really important, because I think some of my deepest or most expressive anger has come out of a sense of embarrassment of what I've done. And then I get really angry because I've been caught somehow. So I do think there are other more primary emotions underneath the anger.
For the sake of our viewers, can you talk about the difference between primary and secondary emotions?
Well, anytime somebody feels a secondary emotion, you always have to ask yourself, like secondary being anger, you have to say, what is underneath that anger? And that would be the primary emotion. So let's say I get really angry because my 3-year-old daughter throws a fit in the grocery store. And I get really angry at her. Why am I angry? I'm embarrassed because of the behavior. So the anger is just the cover-up for a primary.
Yeah, I think when I become angry, I would say that my primary emotion, and if this isn't primary, then I can be corrected, obviously, but I think that my primary emotion is most often fear.
Yeah.
Because it is fear that either the plan that I have in place is about to erode, the hopes that I have are about to dissipate or disappear, really, we're getting to the good stuff here, and that is the fear really is that I'm not enough. I mean, that's what really is at the center of it all. So again, as I often say in our meetings and try to be vulnerable as best I know how, is in my healthiest, I can say, that's what's at work here. But when I'm either tired or haven't taken Sabbath or not being reflective, it's not going to come out as what's happening here is I'm afraid, or I'm really hitting some deep stuff that I'm fearful that I'm not enough. What's really happening here is I'm just angry.
Yeah.
And I'm confident as head of staff, that it can come out really sideways. But I really try to be mindful of those reactions.
And it's safer for many of us to be angry than to face the vulnerability of that primary emotion of fear, not enoughness, embarrassment, disappointment, hurt.
Yeah. And I would think it would be interesting too, I know I don't want to take over here, but I think also too, I still believe there are gender norms around men and women. And to also, to circle back and say, because I try to increasingly be willing to say to people, that wasn't the appropriate response, and I'm sorry, and here's what I believe was happening in that moment. Or even to say, I don't know what was happening in that moment, but I'm going to continue to work to discover it or to figure it out or to work on it or, whatever. And sometimes it's really just, I was tired and I acted out sideways or, things like that. But, that is a level of vulnerability that you have to feel safe to be able to express. But it's also, and people have to be willing to hear it.
Right. Well, Tibbetts talks about good side of anger and bad side of anger. Anger indicates something's wrong, confronts a concern, seeks clarification. To me, it should say can do these things.
Exactly. Yeah.
Prompts you to assert yourself, can fuel our efforts. I love this. Anger leads to a spirited and rewarding life. Again, can lead to.
Yeah.
Bad side of anger, I blame someone else. I see myself as a victim of what has been done to me. And he says it's a negative or a bad thing that I get attention when I'm angry. I feel powerful because I can either intimidate others or manipulate them by making them feel guilty. So that was kind of new for me to really make a list of good and bad aspects of anger. As we've already said this evening, most of us just thought it was kind of a bad thing and we avoided it. What would you say is good or bad about your anger?
I think a good side of my anger drives me to confront situations either locally or globally that I need to confront. So, for instance, part of what was driving the conversations around race and privilege was I was just angry about some of our nation's response to, or lack of response. And so trying to fuel that in healthy ways. And then sometimes it causes me to confront or to build better systems and situations when I'm just frustrated or angry about things that I see in my own life or in the worlds that I walk in.
For me, the good side of anger is and twofold. One is confronting injustice without becoming self-righteous. So I'm with you on that. When I see something that's really unjust, I get really angry as long as it doesn't become self-righteous anger.
How do you know you've crossed that line?
I'm right and you're all wrong.
Okay. No, I hear that. I'm just
in a way of not recognizing that there are aspects of the other person's perspective that I may not be seeing.
Yeah, the complexities of it.
Yes, so I would say, so that's when dealing with his systemic injustice. But then the personal side of the good side of anger, for me, is it's caused me to be much more assertive. I have found myself as I've gotten older, I don't think I was very assertive in my younger years. I didn't know how to be. And as I've become more assertive, I just take situations and I don't worry as much about what people think. I'm not unkind. I just say what I need to say and move forward. So that's the good side of anger for me.
And what I think is so interesting is I think that as I get older, less is more.
Less is more in what way?
Less anger, more tempered response. Like to me, I see that as a sign of both personal and professional maturity, as we talked about last week, for me. So I just think it's interesting. I think obviously some of it's personality, some of it is, I think, gender norms. I'm sure there's lots of stuff in it, but I just think it's interesting. I really do think probably a lot of it's rooted with being raised as a woman in an earlier time where women were expected to sit and just agree. But it's just interesting.
Yeah, I do think that it's been my experience that women find their voice the older they get.
Yeah.
Especially in my generation, I think younger women, certainly my daughters, have found their voice very early.
Well, actually, I was actually just thinking, my family well, but I was just thinking about my mother and my sister and thinking, okay.
But it is different.
Yeah.
I
It's
do think it's a generational issue, is that our peers have certainly found their voice the older we've gotten.
Yes.
Yeah.
And my children and grandchildren certainly found their voices long before I did.
And assertiveness is about finding our voices now, isn't it?
That's right.
Yes.
Well, in this, he talks about, and this is something that keeps coming up, that the problem is not being angry, but clinging to one's anger. And that's what generates the distressing side effects, including health problems, which I know last week we talked about the study related to hypertension. And in the introduction, I think he had given this parable of a culture or a group of people who were holding on to hot rocks to throw at each other. Yeah. And I don't need the whole piece, but just the image of holding onto a hot rock and what it does, you're just burning your hand. How do you keep yourself from not holding on, or maybe do you think you do hold on too long to that hot rock of anger?
I think what has happened, and this is definitely a learned behavior, is I have learned how to assume better intent with other people instead of immediately assuming bad intent. That's what we talked about last week, is that I have really learned to assume the best motives in another person, whether or not that's true. Sometimes I find out later it's not, but I think most people try, or they're trying their best. That's helped me a lot. The other thing that has helped me not to hold on to it is to stop rehearsing my grievance story over and over. I know we're going to talk about that more today. And I think the last thing is to know that in any situation, I need to look at myself to see if there's anything I contributed to it. And that's helped me stay out of that vicious cycle of holding on.
To it.
I think for me, it's, I think twofold. One is, when speaking of the grievance story, is I think so often when you write your grievance story or you recite your grievance story, that it's really easy to put yourself in the victim role. And while, again, I don't want to take away from those who have been true victims, but I think a lot of us haven't been, and yet want to claim that we have. And I've just walked away from enough situations where I think, oh, it's not, like they have a completely different view of that situation. And so I just think to myself, I don't want to portray myself as a victim when I have very rarely ever been a victim of a situation. And so I think about that. And then the reality is, like, I don't like being around angry people. I just don't. So I don't want people to not want to be around me because they perceive that I'm an angry person. So I just think about it in very practical ways.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. There's so much in this chapter, and we've got a couple others. I want to just talk about, because we've been talking about expressing anger, and Tibbetts talks about doing it passively aggressively or assertively, and passively certainly ignoring it, withdrawing, avoiding, aggressively being, the lashing out, attacking, manipulating others, and then assertively confronting, being honest, stating expectations, setting boundaries, detaching. It sounds to me, Deb, like what you're talking about is a good example of assertively expressing your anger assertively. How can we help ourselves get there? How did you learn that behavior? But I mean, it's clear he's not making any. It's not implicit or less than obvious. He says there's the best way. I mean, passively and aggressively are not good ways.
Right.
Assertively can be healthy and can be good. So how do we get there? How do we learn to express our anger in assertive ways that are healthy?
I just want to ask a quick side question. Do you think assertive has a bad connotation?
I don't, but do you?
I don't know. Like, I kind of went back and forth on that because, like, I want people to understand that that Dr. Tibbetts in this is expressing this as the healthy way to do it. And I don't know. Like, I think...
Is there another word that you
I don't
would
know.
use?
Like, I should have just, gone to the thesaurus. But I just want people to understand that this is the healthy way and the good way to do it. Because... but I was just curious. Clearly, there's something there that catches with me, and so I need to work on that.
It might
as well,
be overused.
Yeah, perhaps so. But I just
Yeah.
So I just was asking that side question. My
Yeah.
apologies. Yeah.
I have been guilty of both passive behavior and aggressive behavior. And passive led me to feeling like a victim and helpless. Aggressive led me to regrets about not being the best version of myself. And so I have come to work on assertiveness so I can avoid those things.
Sure.
And so I think for me, it's just about, first of all, I'm only assertive in situations where I actually think it can work. Because there's some people with whom you can't do it because they're not healthy enough that you're just going to get blasted back. So, because it takes a certain vulnerability to be assertive, I think.
Yeah.
So, I count my costs and then I do it.
Yeah.
And sometimes I don't.
But that's a very good point because he includes in his definition of assertive confronting the problem, stating it objectively, being clear and specific, focusing on how you're hurt rather than how you're angry, but set boundaries and then establish consequences when necessary. I mean, that does take vulnerability and a lot of trust that you're not just going to get a retort of anger back at you.
But in that case, the last two take care of it for me, is that if I get blasted back when I think, rationally shared my experience and get confronted, I set clear boundaries and say, I think this conversation is over,
over now.
and then I walk out.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, I think something that Deb said a second ago that really stood out to me, which is, there sometimes is a cost-benefit analysis, right? I mean, sometimes you have to say, is this worth it?
Yeah.
If there is that blowback, is it worth it? I mean, I had a very difficult professional relationship at one point, and I had a professional coach who said, if this person continues to treat you this way, it is appropriate to stand up and say, I feel like we both need time to cool off. I'm going to come back in 10 minutes. And this person was my superior, if you will, in the organizational chart. And I just remember thinking, oh my gosh, how confrontational that was, but at the same time, I only had to do it once. And it reset the boundaries in a way that really needed to be reset.
That's
and,
right.
And it was, and there was nothing passive or aggressive about it. And there was, and I didn't ever, sit around and brag. There wasn't anything to brag about. It was just simply, it had to be reset. And so again, setting those clear boundaries, and it was worth it because I knew it could also mean there could be really significant consequences, but I was also not going to be treated like that anymore.
Yeah.
Well, I do want to move on to the next chapter, but just to sort of summarize in chapter 3 about anger, he says this: none of us chooses to become angry, but we most certainly choose how we respond to the hurt that triggered our anger. And when you take control of your anger, it will cease to control you. Mm-hmm. And I think that those are helpful things for me to try to remember and live into, as it were. And sort of following right on the heels of that, in chapter 4, chapter 4 is called "What You Tell Yourself Can Kill You." Yeah. And he talks a lot here about the mind-body connection and how the way that we think affects how our body feels, about the effect of anger physiologically, and the fact that it's not just what has happened, but how we think about what has happened. And I really resonated with a lot of this as in my other life as an educational psychologist, being so aware of how much perception is reality in terms of how we respond, even if it isn't the real thing. So he says that anger can kill us. He has a study about people with the highest anger scores. This was fascinating to me. Back in medical school, had the highest incidence of heart disease 25 years later, and that it really is this prolonged anger that has the devastating effects on our bodies. And this wasn't exactly in my questions, but it just makes me think, what are some of the ways that you are aware either of anger or other emotions affecting you physiologically, affecting your body?
Oh, I will just tell you, because this was very real for me this week. You know that I lost my mother, and I had this visual image that I'd been carrying, the worry about her as she had, her health had declined, on my shoulders. I had this visual image with my coach. And I realized that my shoulders have been tense for months, and I didn't put two and two together. And now that I'm aware of it, I'm kind of letting it go, and as I'm grieving, it was very tangible, that body mind connection. Yeah.
It's so interesting because mine is shoulders and neck as well, physically. And again, not a victim story, but just a realistic story, and that is to make it through this far into the year without having taken vacation is very odd for me because of the pandemic. And so I did in starting in September, did a staycation and things like that, which is also not what I typically do. But I remember actually when Deb's mom passed away, calling her, and we were talking, and I was talking about, she asked if I was starting to relax some, and I said, it was only 2 nights ago that I felt my shoulders starting to come down from my earlobes. And it really is a physical sensation of sitting down on the couch and realizing, oh my gosh, I need to relax my shoulders. But then I was having neck pain, which I have not typically had. But part of what I realized was there was just all this tension. And it's not even like bad tension. It's like you're just in this mode of doing things. And because I had spent the first 9.5 months without giving myself that break, I had not had any rest from that. And so it was just feeling that starting to physically relax. It was just an interesting, and I've experienced that before, but it had been a while since I had had it to that level.
And I wonder about our viewers, the stress of this pandemic and
Well,
this
yeah.
time, how it's impacted their health.
Well,
the-
and it's very interesting to pick up on that because he
Yeah.
talks about the difference between acute and chronic stressors.
Yeah.
And that acute stress can actually make you stronger because you get the adrenaline and do what you need to do. But that chronic stressors can take their toll on the body. And certainly, back in March, I did not anticipate we were going to be in this for this long. And I think now that the pandemic certainly qualifies as a chronic stressor.
Oh.
And yeah, what do you think is the effect? And I guess not related to the book exactly, but what do we do as a church to help people deal with the chronic stress of the pandemic that they're living through, so that it doesn't eat their bodies completely? I mean,
Right.
to be
Well, I think,
gross.
I mean, so pandemic, race relations,
Politics.
upcoming election. I mean, so pick one, pick all three, or, it would be interesting to look statistically, but perhaps we're just more aware of it, or I'm just more aware of it, but it feels like, and we've had no deaths related to COVID-19, but it feels like we've had more deaths this summer than perhaps other summers, or maybe because I haven't taken vacation time, I'm just more aware of them. But I just think to myself, I haven't had the loss of a parent or the illness of a loved one directly, but as pastors, we all feel the ones that we have in our congregation. And I just think, okay, so pick a chronic situation that's been a part of our narrative as a nation. And so, that's part of why we as a church have really worked so hard on this virtual ministry, is because we want to find ways that while we cannot be together in a corporate way for a corporate worship, how can we be together in ways that people can feel connected to the church, to each other, and so, there have been prayer groups, the men's group meets online, there's the clergy roundtables, obviously worship, but then even, they're not simple, but simple things like the choir videos that music ministry has done and things, just to try to capture people's hearts and to perhaps for just a moment get your mind off of those big things, big issues, because my gosh, the list is not small of things that we're dealing with.
And I would say one of the things, because I do congregational care, I hear a lot of stories. And I have found that I ask people a lot of questions about what is giving you joy. What's a highlight of your week when I talk to them on the phone? What are you looking forward to? And to try to also flip it, because I think what I'm learning from this book is that what you focus on enlarges. Mm-hmm. And when we focus on all of the pain, it's there, not in denial, it's there, but I can reframe it, or I can focus on something else that will give joy in the midst of it all. And so that's one of the things that I do. I do it for me, I do it for others.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I was thinking, following his discussion of acute versus chronic stressors, he talks about the problem of repression and how what it does to us to repress that anger and not acknowledge it, and we can do it intentionally or unintentionally, but it makes me think that he certainly didn't intend these lessons, but the lesson of thinking about what you focus on, but also not repressing the hurt or the anger that you feel about all this, because it's real, and we need to talk to somebody about it. And looking for the joy. And the other thing he talks so much about is taking control, that I'm the only one who can change myself. None of us have the capacity to change the pandemic. And so thinking about what can I change? What can I do each day that's going to be a resource to help get me through, to help find joy, to help another person, to focus on other people, not just myself. But certainly they're stressor times, and in that sense, to also recognize, to go back to something that I think was last week, maybe it was earlier today, but the notion that all of that stress affects our relationships. And so it may cause more anger in our relationships. Absolutely. And just owning that and saying, you know what's going on here is that I'm really afraid of the virus. I'm really afraid that this is never going to end, or whatever, so that we don't break or further harm relationships, and we can help each other instead.
It's just telling the truth about what's going on in us with those people we're with, because that's where we hurt each other. You know, when we don't own, I've had a really bad day, and instead of letting it spill out onto somebody else in anger, I can own it, and it resets everything.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, I think that's helpful. As I said, he talks a lot about the power of our thinking, and says the healing properties of our mind, that it is the interpretation of the event, that not the event itself, that triggers our anger. And if we can learn to see the person differently or the event differently, then that thinking about it differently, the reframing that you mentioned, can actually change how our body's reacting. And so we can't change what happened, or even what is happening, but we can change our perception of it. So can you describe a time when you interpreted an event or a conversation or something that happened one way, and you discovered later that what had occurred could be understood completely differently, and it changed how you or the other person felt about it?
I had a really hard time thinking of one. I really did. How about you?
I was going to say, I didn't frankly come up with a specific one.
Yeah.
What I did think about was the countless number of situations where I perhaps obsessed over it, or really felt that there was some huge injustice or some huge problem, and ended up talking to the person or finding out later that, just like not even on the radar. It was just a passing moment for them. And here I am thinking, oh, this is all really bad and really, whatever. And they were like, remind me again when that happened, or, something like that.
Sure.
And I just think about the number of situations that I've had like that.
Well, he does give the example, it's actually in the next chapter, but about a professor who had a certain view of his students, as he'd been given the highest achieving class, and he was so excited, and he had so much fun with them. And that's actually, there are research studies talking about the effect of the expectations on our beliefs. And I do think that there is an important lesson there, that what we think is the reality is not, that what we hold on to is our perception, and that sometimes we have to ask the other person, did I get this right? Is that what really happened? Or to just own that just because I think X doesn't mean X is what happened, or that X is the reality, and that It goes back to changing myself, changing the way that I think about it. And so he goes on then in terms of forgiveness, and that forgiveness is part of how we can change our bodies and heal our bodies. And so I'm just curious if you can think of times when you've experienced the power of forgiveness, either that you forgave someone and the power of that, or that someone else forgave you, or witnessed it as a pastor. And just clearly the focus of the book is that forgiveness heals. And so just any stories from your own lives?
I'll share a story. I was going back thinking about it, and I have a really wonderful sister-in-law. And there was a lot of, she raised her children very differently than we raised our children. We had a lot more limits, more structure. She was kind of a free spirit. And I think she felt judged by me. And in fact, probably was judged by me. And I was doing some self-reflection as I was doing a 12-step process. And I realized I must have really hurt her. So I was out in California one time, and I said, "Do you have a few minutes?" And I asked her for forgiveness for judging her when she was raising her children. She said, "Yeah, I felt judged by you." And it was the beginning of a complete change of the relationship, because that barrier was gone. Mm-hmm. And yeah, it was pretty powerful for both of us.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing.
I had a very powerful experience of forgiveness, both as a pastor and as a friend. There was a member of my previous congregation and someone who I considered a friend, and I was with a different person who knew my friend from a distance and brought him up in conversation, and I just mouthed off being goofy, and the other person misinterpreted it and then went on to tell the friend about that and to really blow it out of proportion. But it was dangerous in the sense that as a pastor, it was really harmful, could have been very harmful for my ministry and certainly harmful for that friendship. And the friend confronted me about it, really, I think the next day or a couple days later. And it was one of those really wonderful moments when I just said, yeah, I said it, and I didn't mean it. It was a bad situation, blah, blah, blah. And I really need your forgiveness. And he granted it to me. Mm-hmm. And it has done nothing but deepen our friendship and our relationship. And actually, I'm thinking now, I think he's come to Florida. He travels a lot for work. And I think 2 or 3 times has worshiped here. And he and his husband have been with us once or twice here. Once he was traveling for work here for Holy Week, and I just remember thinking, especially in the poignancy of Holy Week, about the journey of that. And it was just such one of those moments where I was so powerless to anything but his forgiveness. Yeah. And it was absolutely transformational for me.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
I hate to do this, but I'm looking at the clock and thinking I got to move to chapter 5 because it's called Birth of a Grievance Story, and that is another central theme of the book. Yeah. It goes back to what we tell ourselves. Tibbet says, life is profoundly influenced by the stories you believe, including the stories you tell yourself. And he sort of walks through this scenario that someone has offended you, and so you begin telling yourself stories that emphasize the negative features, and this grievance story evolves where you're trying to make sense of it, and you do that by attributing the negative motives to the other person and giving yourself, a clear pass, and this becomes the story that you repeat, that you tell to everybody, and that grievance story stands in the way of you being able to forgive because you're just holding on to that story. You take the offense personally, you keep repeating it until, quote, the score gets evened. So, do you have an example of a grievance story? Or,
How vulnerable do we want to get?
That's what I was gonna say.
Oh, yeah.
Well, and have you ever had a grievance story that you tell, after the fact, and after you've held on to this story or retold the story so many times, and either friends or, in my situation, particularly family, and they've actually had the courage to say, "That's not how that happened."
Oh.
Well, I would say former friends because I would just, no. But, I think that's what happens often in grievance stories is, we hold on to them and they grow in legend in our own minds. Yeah. And then we become a greater victim, and the person that we're angry with becomes a greater demon or villain. And then it just grows and grows and grows. I mean, it's both what we tell ourselves and
it's even more dangerous when a group gets together and creates a story about one person. That's where mobbing happens in work environments.
Yeah.
And I will
thankfully it never happens in churches.
Never.
No, but it can happen in work environments.
But that's what happens is that the dangerous part, and I have experienced that, so that's why I'm saying it, is that somebody tells a grievance story about one person, and then somebody else says, "Oh yeah, and you know what else happened?" And somebody else says, "Yeah, that happened too." And together you create a grievance story, and it is even more toxic than you doing it by yourself.
That is the definition of mob mentality, right? I mean, where it is just this, growing. So no, I don't have an example to give. I wish I did. But I'm really not even hiding behind not being vulnerable enough, but it's just, I really have had that experience before where I've either told a grievance story or I've listened to a grievance story. And I've done this as a pastor. I mean, this is, I think, the vulnerable work of pastoral ministry is to say to someone, "That's not how I remember it," or that's powerful work. It can be painful work too.
I will honestly say, yeah, I've participated in a grievance story with a particularly difficult person in my life, and would retell it in my mind. And finally, somebody said to me, "Are you tired of it yet?" And that really was. And I had to honestly say, not yet. No. But I want to be there. Yeah. And so that was probably the turning place where I said, "God, make me want to let go of this because it's really, really unhealthy."
Yeah.
Well, I hesitate only because of time, but I thought about this and I thought this is one tiny outcome of the book, but this is a story Deb has heard, a grievance story of mine that a few close friends have heard, and I finally thought, Sharon, this is ridiculous. Let it go. I was 18. That was a long time ago. But I had traveled to Europe with a very close friend, and we were living in homes in different, close to each other, but different homes in Switzerland and then in France, and then we hitchhiked for 8 weeks. And so we were together a lot that hitchhiking time, and by the end, we were not getting along. And my husband always says you should never ask a question unless you're prepared for the answer. But I asked this friend, because we were not getting along, and I said, is this because I've changed, because we used to be such good friends, or is it because you've gotten to know me better? And she said, it's because I've gotten to know you better. Wow. And I have carried that story around so long, and it has been an excuse, I think, for not being vulnerable with other people.
Sure.
Because if you get to know me better, you won't like me anymore.
What's a self-fulfilling prophecy?
Exactly. And finally, I don't know which moment in the book I thought, okay, that has been my grievance story, and it really is time I've retired
To let it go. It's out there.
And and I'm sure I haven't had contact with her in many, many, many years.
Well, let's look her up.
I'm sure she doesn't remember. It probably had no effect on her.
Right.
But it had a tremendous effect on me.
But again, it is such the narrative. 18 is on the upper end of it, but I believe Deb's the therapist on the chancel, but it is the narrative of when we are young, how that charts the course. I will not disclose your age, but at 18, think about what tremendous impact that has had on so many wonderful people who could have had the just gift of calling you friend, that perhaps those doors have maybe not closed, but not been as widely opened because of one comment from one person at 18.
Yeah.
Every time, and again, this is from some of my own work, but I just think how many times I've run up against that.
Yeah.
Of how impactful
I've been moved to let it go.
Yes.
So
Disney has a whole movie about that.
that's right. Well,
Not Disney. It is
we
Disney.
do have to wind down, but kind of the end of the story, as it were, is that the problem with grievance stories is we think they are reality, and they're not. They are our perception of what has happened, and that as long as we allow them and hold on to them, they're controlling our story, and the main character is the one who hurt you. And so the recommendation is let it go. Forgiveness doesn't ask you to forget truth, but to remember it more fully, and to make our stories more accurate. I want to find the place where he says it the best. But forgiveness challenges you to change the way you think, minimize distortions, revise and correct the inaccurate story you've been telling yourself. Truth and reality are the only effective cures for healing the distortions. So I think we're just about at time. Last thoughts about grievance stories or forgiveness things before we
Well, one
wrap
of
up.
the things is I know we had to rush through grievance stories, but you can be assured that the next 2 weeks at least,
right.
we're going to be continuing to talk. This was just the intro.
Right.
Yeah.
Because it's really at the heart and soul of this book is starting to look at those narratives that we have created, because that's what keeps us from forgiving. So thank you so much for starting us on that journey.
I think about the first time I went to Disney World 3 years ago.
That was the first time?
I know, right? In my late 30s. But the best gift was I saw it through the eyes of nieces and nephews, or my nephew. And they have a show of Frozen, which of course the song from that is Let It Go. And you have never lived until you've watched a theater full of children screaming at the top of their lungs, let it go. And I just think about that as so much of the theme of forgiveness and our grievance story is it's sitting in a theater full of people singing at the top of their lungs, let it go. Because I'm as much to myself as any of us, is that's what we have to do.
Yeah.
And get to a place where we can do that in a healthy way.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, to go back to what he says about the power of forgiveness, healing our bodies, but the reminder, and this will come up again and again in the weeks ahead, that holding on to your anger only hurts you. And as Deb has said, when you forgive, you set a prisoner free, and that prisoner is you. So I would like, in the spirit of, I back up, I do this a lot. Don't finish my sentence. I think we love engaging with each other, and that we're trying to both talk about something that is not necessarily in the church. Forgiveness is not just a church thing, but trying to do that through the lens of faith, talking about the role of the church and how that helps us. And I hope it's helpful to our viewers. It certainly is helpful to me and stimulating to be thinking about some hard issues, but important issues. And so I thank both of you, and again, thank our help, those who are making it possible. And if you would just join me in a word of prayer.
Absolutely.
Sure.
Loving God, we give you thanks for all of the ways that you touch our lives, for one another and all those who are joining us in mind and heart via technology, for authors whose words cause us to think and learn and grow, and above all else, for your spirit and your love which is in us and moves through us. Help us to be faithful to your love in our love for one another and for all the world you created. We pray in your many names. Amen.
Amen.